You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, today was a major deadline for Trump in the matter of this question of presidential immunity, which right now is all that's standing in the way of the DC prosecution moving forward. So, did the Trump team meet this deadline, and what is it that they filed?
Yeah, just under the wire, shortly before 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Trump's defense team filed a request for a stay with the Supreme Court. What does that mean? So the appellate court that rejected Trump's claim that a president has absolute immunity and can commit all of the crimes he wants against the American people while in office with complete impunity and immunity, the appellate court smacked that down unanimously. And they gave Donald Trump about a week to apply to the Supreme Court for a stay. What does that mean? They said after a week, we're going to return this trial, this case, to Judge Chutkan, who's presiding over this prosecution in DC, and she will put it right back on the trial track unless you ask the Supreme Court to specifically step in with a stay, a pause, put a stop to us returning it to Judge Chutkan for trial. So just under the wire today, Donald Trump's team filed with the Supreme Court a request to stay the case so that it doesn't go back to Judge Chutkan, but we just continue to sort of tread justice water until the Supreme Court resolves this issue.
And this won't mean necessarily that the Supreme Court is going to take it up for review themselves. This is just asking the Supreme Court to stay this right now. Is that correct?
It absolutely does not mean the Supreme Court will take this up for review. As of right now, Trump has requested not that they review it, but just that they issue a stay so that everything remains at a dead stop. Why? Because all Trump cares about is delay, delay, delay. He wants to push this trial and, frankly, every trial until after the November 2024 election in hopes that, in the horrific event he gets elected president again, we all know what he's going to do. He's going to appoint a corrupt attorney general. He will order that person to dismiss the two federal cases pending against him. And heck, for all we know, he may throw in a self pardon in the process, kind of a belt and suspenders approach to presidential corruption.
All right, so he's seeking this stay. What about seeking review? Like, what happens next? When does he actually move forward, or when does somebody move forward with the next steps in this thing, which is actually to get the ball rolling, get it in front of the Supreme Court so this thing could be adjudicated once and for all, and then finally move back to trial track?
Yeah, so there are now two things that we're keeping our eye on. First, what will the Supreme Court do with this request for a stay? Brian, I believe they need 5 Supreme Court justices to vote in favor of a stay. Why? Because a stay would basically be telling the lower appeals court, which unanimously rejected Donald Trump's request, unanimously by the 3 judges who sat and heard the oral argument, to sort of put a stop to it. And so it's kind of an extraordinary request that you stay or pause the lower court unanimous ruling. So he has to show that he is likely to win on the merits, and he has to convince 5 justices to vote in favor of the stay. So the stay is not a done deal. The next thing we'll be keeping our eye on is, when does Donald Trump file his request that the Supreme Court take up the issue of presidential immunity, which is related to a request for a stay, but it's slightly different. He has some time to file that. But, I think all normal filing deadlines are off. We have already seen the appellate court below sort of truncate and short circuit the filing deadlines by setting extremely short fused deadlines, like the 1 week to ask for a stay. So I have a feeling we're going to know pretty quickly whether the Supreme Court is going to decide to take up the case in substance by what they decide to do on the request for the stay.
Right. Basically, if they don't grant the stay, then we can read into that this idea that they probably aren't even going to accept it for review.
We sure can. So there are 2 possibilities. There are a lot of, this fingers out procedurally in a number of ways. If the Supreme Court rejects the request for the stay, which is what they should do, and what I suspect they'll do, but I wouldn't put the full dollar on it. I would put maybe 50 cents of my betting limit of $1 on them rejecting Trump's request for a stay. If they reject the request for a stay, that is a pretty strong signal that they're not going to take up the absolute immunity case for review at all. Because if they were, they would probably grant the stay. However, here is the outlier. They could say, we reject your request for a stay. We're giving it back to Judge Chutkan so it can get back on the trial track. However, we will take it for review. Why would they do that? Ordinarily, Brian, the Supreme Court wouldn't accept the case for review if they were simply going to agree with what the lower appellate court did, how the lower appellate court resolved the case. However, because this is such a novel issue, does a president have absolute presidential immunity? Not to sort of bury the lead, he doesn't. And ultimately, I believe the Supreme Court will say he doesn't. But the Supreme Court might want to accept review so they can write their own long, flowery analysis of just why a president does not enjoy absolute immunity. So that can then be the precedent for the ages, not just the appellate court three-judge opinion that concluded he doesn't have presidential immunity.
Okay. Now, Glenn, the three-judge panel, this was a bit of a revelation that that you brought up in the last video on this issue that we did. But the three-judge panel from the D.C. Court of Appeals said that if the Trump team seeks en banc review, meaning review from the entire appeals court, that it would trigger the case being pushed back onto the trial track so that Judge Chutkan could then move forward and pick a new trial date. How is that factoring in here?
Yeah, there are more procedural twists and turns than your, amusement park roller coaster
Right.
on this one. So the appeals court said, oh, you want the full appellate court en banc, all of the judges to review what the three-judge panel unanimously ruled? That's fine. Go ahead and file for that full court review. If you do, we're still going to give the case right back to Judge Chutkan and get it back on the trial track, unless you ask the Supreme Court to stay it, which Donald Trump's lawyers have now done. Here's an interesting little twist. In what Donald Trump's lawyers just filed, one of the asks that they make of the Supreme Court is, and we want you to go back to the ordinary procedure whereby if we ask for en banc full court review, the stay remains in place. Basically, we want you to override what the DC Federal Circuit Court of Appeals tried to do by sort of tightening that deadline as well. That's an additional ask they put in the first few pages of what is a 110-page legal filing. Brian, sometimes I urge our viewers to go ahead and pull up a copy of a particular pleading or motion and read it for themselves. I am not going to make that ask because it's 110 pages of the same old nonsense and the same tired, losing arguments that Trump's lawyers have now just sort of retread, lost in front of Judge Chutkan, lost unanimously in front of the three-judge panel, and now they're trotting out the same arguments. I do recommend maybe our viewers read the first few pages, if only because they are sad and laughable. The first line actually quotes Yogi Berra, that noted legal scholar, and they quoted him as saying, oh, this is like deja vu all over again. Ordinarily, you don't open a Supreme Court brief with a joke, but what they did was they quoted Yogi Berra, they criticized special counsel, and they sucked up to the Supreme Court justices all in the first page. So you want a little bit of levity, go ahead and read the first few pages of Trump's new court filing.
But Glenn, just to clarify here, in terms of seeing review accepted by the Supreme Court, there does have to be some issue with the lower court's ruling. Like we can't just see the Supreme Court willy-nilly decide to override or overrule the lower court on just any issue just because they feel like it. That would suggest that there's some issue with what the DC Court of Appeals had done.
Exactly. Usually the Supreme Court, or at least a number of Supreme Court justices, when they are deciding whether to accept a case for review, usually it's because a number of the Supreme Court justices tend to disagree with the lower court ruling, and they feel like they need to set something straight. Here, there is no constitutional principle that needs to be discussed,
Right.
debated, illuminated. There can be no disagreement, in my opinion, with the reality, as announced by that three-judge panel, that there's no support in the law for the notion of absolute presidential immunity. When I say the law, there is no federal law on the books that say a president's immune from prosecution. There is no appellate court case law, no precedent up to and including the Supreme Court ever announcing that a president is immune from prosecution. And there's nothing in the Constitution saying or suggesting a president is immune from prosecution. In fact, Brian, the impeachment judgment clause says the exact opposite. It says even if a president is impeached, he can still be prosecuted, which lends considerable support for the conclusion that a president can be prosecuted. And let me talk about one dramatic misstatement in the first few pages of Trump's brief. His lawyers say that what that three-judge panel did represents a, quote, breach of precedent and historical norms. Let me shoot down that misrepresentation. There is no precedent saying a president is immune from prosecution. So it is a misrepresentation to say that the lower appellate court breached precedent and historical norms. Excuse me, but everybody understood that Richard Nixon could be prosecuted for his crimes and likely would be prosecuted for his crimes, which is precisely why Gerald Ford, the incoming president, when Richard Nixon resigned, pardoned him because Gerald Ford said he could otherwise be prosecuted for his crimes. So you want to talk historical norms? Historical norms are that everybody always believed a president could be prosecuted for his crimes. And it's those kind of misrepresentations in a brief that goes to the Supreme Court that I think will come back to bite them and that are truly just a sad commentary on the state of lawyering on behalf of Donald Trump.
Damn, Glenn's on fire here. Glenn, let's finish off with this. When are we likely to get a response by the Supreme Court to this question, and what would that response include? Because I know we had spoken about just this idea of whether they would grant the stay or if they'll say something further about accepting review of the case itself.
Let me tell you what my hope is and then what my expectation is. My hope is that they being the Supreme Court justices, take an early preliminary vote. Hey, anybody really want to take this case up and grant this stay? I'm hoping that it's 9-zip. Now, that's my hope. 9-zip against granting the stay so we can get this trial back on track. We can get this justice show on the road, and we can get Donald Trump tried and, based on the quality and quantity of the evidence, very likely convicted and sentenced well in advance of the 2024 presidential election. My expectation is, they're going to take some time thinking deep thoughts and engaging in some legal navel gazing, and then finally decide whether they want to grant this stay or not. But I do believe that they understand time is of the essence. In another high stakes case that involved the upcoming election, that is whether Donald Trump is disqualified from even being on presidential ballots, they really did move through that very quickly to oral argument, and we're expecting a decision promptly. So similarly, I think they're going to resolve the stay question promptly, and that, whether they grant it or deny it, is going to tell us a lot about what they're thinking about the topic of presidential immunity.
Well, to that point, whenever we have any update from the Supreme Court in terms of what they're going to do next, we'll bring it to you. So for those watching right now, if you want to follow along with what happens here, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.